Yeah.
Hello, this is Sultan Al-Zain,
I'm John Magner.
and we are interviewing Mr. Mike Simmons on May 3rd on Friday of 2019 at Oak Creek Library. So, Mr. Simmons, how was it like growing up in Milwaukee in the 70s?
How was it like growing up in the 70s?
70s and 60s.
Well, I was in high school in the 60s. So I lived in Bayview on Bayview on the south side of Milwaukee. I went to Bayview High School, which I only had a couple of blocks to walk to school. So there really wasn't any busing at that time. Just normal high school.
What were your hobbies like during high school and your interests?
Hobbies during high school, I played chess, was involved with early motorcycles, but never got a license at that point. Didn't get into hunting until later on, but did a lot of working while I was junior and senior year, so I didn't have a lot of time for too many hobbies other than cars and girls.
How was it? What was your job like, and where did you work?
I worked at De Marina's Pizza Place. It was on Potter and Wentworth, and we would get out of high school, and the kitchen would open up at 4 o'clock, so we had about 30 minutes to walk to work, and worked until depending on the evening, it would be 10 o'clock at night, sometimes to midnight.
When did you first find out you were going to get drafted?
Once I graduated from Bayview High School, I started going to UWM in Milwaukee, and my initial thing that I wanted to be was an architect. And I started school and I joined the ROTC at UWM. And at that time, it would have been 2 years before I would have gotten into architectural drawing. There was a lot of general art classes, and that time of late 60s, being in ROTC, you had to wear a uniform on campus. That was not the most politically correct thing going on at that time, with anti-war type stuff going on. So after 3 months, I quit UWM and I went to work at Laddish Company in Cudahy.
Okay. When did you first get your draft notice?
Well, I had a deferment because I had started at UWM, and it took about 13 months for the process to catch up that I wasn't going to school and I was classified as 1A, which was draftable. And 13 months after I started, that was, let's see, I got my draft notice in October of '68. And I left for the Army in January 3rd of 1969.
What were your parents' reactions when they first found out that you were going to get drafted?
Well, my mother always knew she had a boy, eventually, that I would be going into the military sooner or later. Once I had turned 18, actually I got drafted when I was 19. She didn't want me to go into the Marine Corps, which my father served in World War II, but I had too many close neighborhood kids that were in the Marines that were getting somewhat messed up. So she said, "You're not going in the Marine Corps." So I let it go as far as going into the Army. luckily enough, or when we were down at the draft board, at that time they were drafting into the Marine Corps. So they would go down to line up and say Army, 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 Marine. I still ended up with the Army.
What were your views on the war, and what were the views of the public on the war in 1969, at the time you were drafted?
There weren't protests, as far as I could tell, that was going on. And while I was prior to me going to Vietnam, while I was there, didn't get a lot of news from what was going on back in the States. I was mainly in the field, and I belonged to the infantry, so didn't see a lot of television.
How was your experience serving in the infantry during the Vietnam War?
We went to, well, I was with the 25th Infantry Division, and we were based out of Cu Chi, Vietnam, which was just west of Saigon. The base camp that I went to after reporting into Cu Chi was Camp Kotrick. That was a little, what we used to call a hard spot. It was a company-size unit with a artillery battery of 3 guns and a mortar platoon which had 3 mortars with them. And it was circular formation, and one platoon would pull security on the base while the other 2 platoons would go in opposite directions for ambush patrols. That seemed to be a daily occurrence. We would go out 2 days in a row, and then we would end up, our platoon would end up with the bunker guard in that evening, and it was just a constant rotation.
During your time in Vietnam, was there ever a time when you were in active gunfire?
Yeah, I was in 3 different firefights that I remember pretty graphically. There was a good friend of mine that lives in Anna, Illinois, that I still keep in contact with. We shared a bunker, but he hit a tripwire which was on a rice paddy berm, and caught some shrapnel in his back, and the shrapnel missed me and hit the guy next to me and missed the next guy. So he ended up getting medevaced, but don't know if I killed anyone, actually. Did a lot of shooting, but I couldn't say for certain that I hit anything.
How was your time at Fort Jackson?
After I left Vietnam, I reported to, actually I went to the Pentagon, and I went to an office in the Pentagon to have my orders changed to Fort Meade, Maryland. And the specialist that I talked to asked me, how would you like to go to drill sergeant school? And I said, okay, well, where's that at? And he said, Fort Jackson. So instead of going to Fort Meade, Maryland, I went to Fort Jackson, South Carolina. I reported into the orderly room, and one of the sergeant majors that I served with in Vietnam was from South Carolina, and he happened to be in the orderly room. And he asked me, what are you doing here? And I said, well, I'm being assigned to go to drill sergeant school. And he said, no, I got a better idea for you. And he put me in the training aids area. So I worked with a staff sergeant from California, and we did a lot of, he taught me how to do sign painting. And we would issue all of the equipment out to the basic training companies. So that was, I did that particular job for almost a year, and met my wife in South Carolina, got married in Lakeview, South Carolina, And at that time, the military was cutting back, and I got what was called a 6-month drop. So I had a job again waiting for me back in at Laddish and Cudahy because by federal law they had to hold that job for me. And so my wife and I came back up here, and I reported back to work at Laddish, and I was laid off. So that was in February of 1972, and I got, let's see, in May of 72, I was called back temporary help, and before Labor Day, then I was called back permanently, so I was only laid off for a couple of months, so that wasn't too bad.
When you came back to Milwaukee after being in the war, was there a difference in atmosphere? Did you notice anything different about the city itself, the people?
Not really. A lot of returning soldiers or Marines or anyone that served in any of the services didn't really talk about their experiences or even let people know that they had served at that point, compared to how it is today. Very graphically different.
After you came back, you joined reserves. How was your experience like throughout the reserves?
Well, a friend of mine came over to my house and asked me about going into the military again in the reserves, and I said, well, let's go down and talk to the technician and let's see what it's about. I went to high school with him. So we went to Logan Avenue. At that time there was a reserve center there, and talked to the technician, and he said, well, if you sign up for a year, see how you like it or whatever. So I said, okay, we'll both of us signed up for a year. My friend got out after the year. I seemed to like the reserves, being with the camaraderie of the people that were serving at that time. So I stayed in, and stayed into the reserves until 2008, actually.
What were your duties like when you were in the reserves?
After that first initial year that I was in the reserves, I did finally go to the drill sergeant school that was being conducted on Logan Avenue. That took a year of going on just strictly weekends and a 2-week annual training. Once I graduated from the drill sergeant school, I served as a drill sergeant for 3 years, and there was a vacancy with our first sergeant. He retired from the reserves, and the battalion commander asked me if I wanted to serve as his company first sergeant. So I said, sure, I'll try that. So I served as a first sergeant for 2 years, and then I went to the operations NCO position and stayed with that for 2 years. And while I was at one of the annual trainings down at Fort Knox, I was applying for battalion sergeant major positions, and I was notified that I had a board to appear before back in Milwaukee, so I drove back up here and went before the appearance board and was selected as one of the battalion sergeant majors. So I stayed at the 1st Brigade, 1351, which was the unit, and went to the 4th Brigade, and between the 1st and 4th Brigades throughout my career, Up until the mid-90s, I rotated back and forth between those two brigades as a battalion sergeant major, and then was selected as a brigade sergeant major. The 84th Division that I belonged to was they were taking the schoolhouse units out of the military inventory, and they were adding them to the training divisions. So I went and served 6 months in Madison to take down one of the school units, and returned back to Milwaukee, and I was with the medical school as its sergeant major. And after the medical school, I was selected as the commandant of the drill sergeant school, and I served in that capacity for almost 3 years, and then I volunteered for a tour overseas in Afghanistan.
What were your biggest challenges while you were serving in the reserves?
The biggest challenge to me was the higher up you went in rank, the farther away you got from daily contact to any extent with the soldiers that you served with. And trying to maintain that contact and taking care of soldiers became a major priority, at least to me.
What is one of the most vivid experiences you remember while you served in the reserves?
During the course of serving with the 4th Brigade on Silver Spring, we were an armor training unit. And whenever they would have parades in Milwaukee, we would be able to take with police escort 1 or 2 of our tanks from Silver Spring down to the south side of Milwaukee. During Armed Forces Week, we would take a tank down to General Mitchell Field at then the 440th, and show the civilian population what it is to do on a tank in all its positions. That would seem to be a lot of fun anyways.
How was your tour in Afghanistan like what made you want to choose to go to Afghanistan?
The regulations at that time, after I was ending my tour as the commandant of the drill sergeant school, I was coming up on 32 years of service, and I would have had to have gone to the inactive reserve. This was in 2003. It was a year and some months after 9/11 occurred. I felt that I could still continue to serve the United States by volunteering to go on active duty tours. I contacted a operations sergeant that was in Atlanta at Army Reserve Command headquarters, and I asked him, what do you have as far as one-year tours? At that time, the Army Reserve Affairs was standing up a 3-person unit in Iraq and a 3-person unit in Afghanistan. So they would have a retention NCO, a sergeant major, and a lieutenant colonel as a team, and I volunteered for the Afghanistan team. We went to Bagram Air Base, was where we were based out of, and Army Reserve Affairs dealt with any problems that soldiers had while they were over there concerning their benefits and payroll or anything that would prevent them or bother them while they were serving on their tours. We were able to join with the active duty component that was on the ground there as far as their finance office and make sure that our reservists and National Guard soldiers were having the benefits that they needed active on their payroll systems. Uh, we joined with the hospital unit that was there and a military police unit that was out of Illinois, and the active component that was at the headquarters of Bagram Air Base, and we started holding promotion boards for not only active soldiers but reservists and National Guard soldiers. But we were able to get reservists promoted even though they were deployed from their home units, regardless of the state that they were in.
What were all the camps and bases that you attended during your time when you were serving?
Well, I served basic training at Fort Campbell, Kentucky, and I served infantry AIT at Fort Dix, New Jersey. I come back from Vietnam and I was at Fort Jackson. During the course of my reserve service, I served at Fort Knox, Fort Sill, Fort Leonard Wood, Fort McCoy, Camp Grayling in Minnesota, that was in Minnesota. There was individual units that we had in Illinois and Iowa. I'm trying to remember the cities that they were located in, but it was mainly the upper Midwest was our brigade areas.
You mentioned being at Bagram. How was it like being there? The atmosphere, being around all the other soldiers, the duties?
We had not only U.S. soldiers at Bagram, but the office that we were in, the building that we were in, was called Motel 6. It was a two-story office building, basically. It was occupied by the Russians when they were in Afghanistan. They used that air base, and a lot of their military aircraft that were damaged were around the airfield yet. But our office was in a corner of the building. We had a New Zealand unit that was in our office next door to us. The finance office was across the hall from us for active duty, and there was supply units in that building. The building in front of ours was the base headquarters building. So their base sergeant major worked out of that office. We had, as I said, New Zealanders, British, Italian, aviation units from various states in the United States. We had National Guard soldiers. We had civilian contractors there. Special Forces units worked out of Bagram. The Marines were in Bagram. That's about all of the units that I can remember that were there.
You mentioned during the pre-interview you served as Central Command for 4 years. How was the whole experience in Central Command like?
After I left Afghanistan, I came home, and before going to Central Command, while I was in Afghanistan, in the middle of that tour, my civilian employer offered an early retirement, so I retired from Laddish. And I come back from Afghanistan, so I'm 55 and a half years old. I do not have a job, and I have 6 months worth of health insurance left. And it'll be 4 years before I get a retirement from the reserves at age 60. During the course of working with Army Reserve Affairs in Bagram, I had a point of contact in the mobilization office in the Pentagon, and I emailed that captain, and I said, what do you have for one-year tours for sergeant majors? She emailed me back 11 different tours throughout the Central Command, area of operations. The one that was not filled the longest was the one that I had as a first choice. And she emailed me back and said, "Congratulations, I've been selected to fill that position," which was with the Force Protection Unit with Central Command based in Camp Asalea in Qatar. So I reported to Camp Asalea, and that particular unit was as I said, a Force Protection Unit. We had 3 teams that worked out of that office. One of them we had stationed in the palace in Baghdad, and they mainly covered Iraq. The other 2 teams went to the other 25 countries that were in the Central Command's area of operations. They were comprised of all service members, active, Guard, Reserve, Army, Air Force, Navy, and Marines. We did not have a Coast Guard person, though. 10 of us were one-year tours, depending on Air Force or Army. The rest of the people that served with that unit, depending on the service that they were with, depended how long their tours were. Some were 4 months, some were 6 months, some were 8 months. We had all different types of MOSs, or military occupational specialties. We had Air Force police, Army MPs, we had chemical officers, chemical NCOs, engineers, served with a couple of Navy chiefs. We had as an executive officer, we had a Navy lieutenant colonel, lieutenant commander, I think they were called. The commander of our unit was a Special Forces full colonel. I worked with a Air Force captain, and we provided the pre-inspection type team. We would go to a country and talk to base commanders and or embassy security personnel, because we dealt with embassies in the various countries. Military personnel that went to the various countries other than Iraq, Afghanistan, Kuwait would stay in hotels. We did inspections basically of bases to look at how we could protect our soldiers from inside the base and how well they could protect themselves from the outside, entry points and those types of things. The teams looked at not only how they could, an enemy could get in, but the food service security, the physical security of the base itself. We looked at hotels, again, how well those were protected for our people that would stay in the civilian cities. So it was a pretty nice tour to be on. We were actually trying to keep our people alive.
What was the most memorable experience you remember? And from the pictures we saw, you got to visit a lot of different places. What were your favorite places to visit and see, and different people and communities and cultures?
Being stationed at Doha in Qatar, our small unit was 45 people strong, but we had the capabilities of going into Doha itself. We had 6 vehicles, civilian SUV type vehicles. Camp Asalea was one of the R&R centers for the theater, and soldiers would and service members would come from Afghanistan and Iraq and Djibouti and take a 3-day pass at our base. So we would go down to the R&R Center and ask if anyone wanted to go into town. And we would take up to 6 people with us, and we would take them to hotels because they had restaurants in the hotels, so they could sample some of the local type food. Doha was a very modern city. It had a 4-story mall, had an ice rink in it, had an amusement park up on the 4th floor. Anything you could buy in the States, you could buy at that particular mall. There was the gold souk if anyone wanted to buy any types of jewelry. I got to know pearl wholesaler. This gentleman served at the university in Qatar as he was an artist, and him and his son ran a pearl business. He dove for his own pearls, basically. The pearl business was very big in Doha prior to the Japanese with their cultured pearls. Kind of took them out of business. But they still do get some saltwater pearls by diving for them. This particular man was in his 60s, and he still dove for pearls. So he would give us, because we would bring our people down there that would look and want to buy pearls, he would give them discounts because he knew that they were military. Same with the jewelers that I had got to know after 4 years. They would give discounts to the soldiers that were coming there. By law over there, jewelry has to be 18 karat gold. It can't be by law less than that. Here you get 14 karat or 10 karat or whatever. You can get some 18 karat here in the States, but not a lot. It becomes a softer metal. Taking the soldiers that were on R&R into the city kind of brought them back to some normalcy, I think, instead of being in combat or in fear of their lives at that point. It was like going to downtown Milwaukee, although I don't know how safe that is anymore.
What was your family's point of view on you serving for how long, from your long career?
Well, when I met my wife, she was in the USO in South Carolina, and so she was familiar with the military. She knew that I would be gone for 2 weeks out of the year serving at annual trainings during the course of my reserve time. The opportunity came up to do the tours in Afghanistan and with Central Command in Qatar. On average, I was home for a 2-week R&R every 6 months. So that time went by very fast. My wife had always supported me through whatever military that I did. My son and daughter were around, so they, helped her out while I was gone. Neighbors would help out, so she supported whatever I did as far as the military.
Was it hard to assimilate after coming back?
Not coming back from Vietnam. No, I went back to my job again. So that really wasn't anything that seemed to me to be any different. Laddish always supported the reserves and National Guardsmen that worked at that company. Nobody was ever given any type of hassles whatsoever for the time off that they needed for annual trainings. By contract, they made up the difference in pay when you were gone for annual training. So they were very supportive of the military. When I came back from Afghanistan, and as I said, I was unemployed at that point. That's why I went on the 4 tours with Central Command until I could retire and collect a pension from the military. When I did come back, I got a part-time job for about 1.5 years to get used to not working. And I had not worked for anyone for almost, well, since 2010 till last year. So I went to work part-time again because I bought a truck. So you gotta pay for things when you get them.
From your long military career, what is some of the most memorable moments you have throughout the whole thing?
Probably one of the memorable things in the reserves was being promoted to Command Sergeant Major. That's the highest rank you can achieve in the military as far as an enlisted soldier. Helping soldiers realize what their potentials are throughout probably the thousands of soldiers that I had come in contact with over the course of my almost 40 years in the military. Afghanistan, I would say we would drive from Bagram Air Base to Kabul, which was the capital, every other week. Driving in Kabul was like a school for a crash course in I'm trying to remember the word for a demolition derby, almost. Flying to with the unit that I was, Force Protection Unit that I was with, flying up into the stands, as they were known, north of Afghanistan, in Turkmenistan and Uzbekistan and Kyrgyzstan. Kyrgyzstan was interesting because that's where, we didn't see it, but that's where the Russians have their Star City, and that's where they do their launches from. So being able to travel around and not worry about being in a combat type situation, I would never have had that opportunity otherwise.
Mm-hmm. Was there anything in your whole career that you would change, or that if you had the opportunity again you would do different?
No, I don't think so. I was extremely lucky for the areas and the areas that I served in. I would try and get a little bit closer to the ground, I think, in one particular occurrence that occurred in Vietnam where I got wounded. I caught some shrapnel in my left ankle from an artillery unit round, so yeah, if I could have been a little bit smaller, that would have helped, probably.
How was it like being wounded? What was your first reaction to getting hit?
I caught a piece of shrapnel right above my boot in my left ankle. It felt like I got hit with a baseball bat. Somewhat shock to your system, not knowing, how bad am I? Knowing that it was in my legs, I felt that, well, I'm not going to die from this. The particular soldier that was next to me, I think he had about a silver dollar piece of shrapnel land in the very center of small of his back. Luckily, it landed flat, and if it would have been cocked any which way, he could have had his spinal cord cut. But as it was, it landed flat. A lot of screaming and yelling going on, confusion. Just something I wouldn't want to experience again.
Throughout your whole career, what was one of the hardest things you had to go through, or any hard decisions you had to make?
As commandant of the drill sergeant school, I had make decisions with some of the soldiers that had spent an entire year going through a school and didn't score high enough to graduate. Knowing that they put a full year of their life into that school, and for whatever reason, were not able to graduate. That was one of the hardest ones that I think that I come across. Not being able to really have the instructors help those guys to really complete that course. It takes a lot of dedication to spend a year of your life trying to get through a school and then come up short at the end.
Okay. We're going to take a small break.
Okay.
And come back after. Okay, so last we were talking about was your difficulties and your hardest decisions you had to make while you were in the military. What is your current relationship with the military like? How are you still involved?
The 84th Division that was up on Silver Spring, they currently are located at Fort Knox, Kentucky. They're no longer, I think there's one battalion still up on Silver Spring. But that particular division now is scattered throughout the United States in very small units. But the soldiers that I served with, they started what was at that time was known as the 84th Alumni Association. Although you didn't have to be gone from the division to belong to it. And that was started in the mid-'80s. When I came back from, after my retirement in 2008, I ran across a couple of the soldiers that I had served with, some of the commanders, and I went to one of the dinners that they had. Actually, it was a Valentine's dinner, and one of the soldiers that was at our table said, how would you like to join our board and come back into at that time, the Alumni Association? So I said, yeah, sure, I'd like to do that. So I got elected as one of the vice presidents of events for the Alumni Association, which is now called the 84th Rail Splitter Association.
Keep going.
Go back to the part, let's continue off the part where you were talking about being elected as vice president and where the name came from of the organization.
Right, so the 84th Division unit patch basically is a axe splitting a rail, which was since Abraham Lincoln served in the Black Hawk Wars in Wisconsin, and he used to split rails. That's where the division got its name from. I also, this same person that asked me to join the Rail Splitter Association asked me if I wanted to serve on a board on the Wisconsin Area Retiree Council up at Fort McCoy. And I said, sure, I'd like to do that. Being involved with retirees, since I am one, and see what's going on. they mainly hold their main function in the Friday after Labor Day in September. And it's a retiree appreciation day at Fort McCoy. And they set up speakers that come in and talk about benefits and pay and what's going on in Congress as far as veterans benefits and insurances and what's going on with TRICARE and the new dental care and all this kind of stuff. So we generally draw anywhere from 300 to 400 people that are retirees in the Wisconsin area that come to Fort McCoy on that day and spend the morning listening to the benefits of what's going on. And then if they have questions, they can talk to the individual speakers in the afternoon to get more personalized if they have some issues with anything as far as the retirees. While I was in Qatar, I bought a Harley Ultra Classic in 2008 through the PX. And one of the things here in Oak Creek at the Legion post off Shepherd Avenue is they have a Legion Rider unit, which is motorcycles basically, and we support all of the parades and fundraising efforts to help veterans. But the 4th of July parades, the Memorial Day parades, Labor Day parades, Heritage Day parades in South Milwaukee we support. Probably at least 75% of our motorcycles have the capability of flying the U.S. flag and all of the service flags. So it's pretty impressive to watch because we're the first unit generally that's down the street on the parade route. And it's pretty impressive when you have a bunch of not only Harleys, but large motorcycles with all of the flags flying. It's pretty patriotic to watch.
You mentioned having an influence on your son who is also currently involved with the military. How was that like in his...
Well, when I was growing up, if you got in trouble with the law, you were given a choice by the judge of going to jail or going to military. Close proximity of that occurred with my son, and he ended up going into the military for 4 years, served as an engineer, and he came back from his active duty, and I'm sure if he sees this, he'll probably wouldn't want it known that he was in trouble with the law at one point, but it was nothing major. But then he went to work for a small waterproofing company, and the health insurance at that time in the 90s, even back then, was very expensive. And the technician that I worked with up on Silver Spring with the 84th mentioned that the recruiting command was looking for reservists to serve as recruiters. So I had him come up and talk to the technician, and he seemed interested in it. Him and his wife were flown to Indianapolis for an interview, and he was selected as a recruiter. And he served 7 years here in Oak Creek. He was up on Prospect, up in Shorewood, close to UWM. That was the recruiting station that he worked out of, which was very odd because normally they move their recruiters around every 3 years. And he was able to stay here in Oak Creek for 7 years. He then got an assignment in Minnesota, working at Fort Snelling. And so he moved him and his family to Minnesota. And he served almost 5 years there at Fort Snelling, and then he was selected for promotion, and he ended up doing a tour in Butte, Montana, and he moved his family out there, kept his house and rented it out in Minnesota, but he kept and his family came with him then. He stayed there for 3 years, and then he was able to get back to Minnesota, where he's still currently serving, and I think he's going to go 1 or 2 more years, and then he'll be able to retire. So he'll have, at that point, 26 years of service in the military. And his second oldest daughter, this past Thanksgiving, joined the military in January of last year, and then she left 4th of July for MP school at Fort Leonard Wood. So we went to her graduation the Wednesday before Thanksgiving, and there was my son in his uniform. I wore my uniform, and my granddaughter in her uniform. So we've got 3 generations of a photograph of 3 generations of military from our family. Some of the people that were in that particular auditorium, there were other soldiers that were retirees that wore uniforms there, but the old dress blues that command sergeant majors or enlisted wear is an impressive uniform, because on the sleeves, on both sleeves, there are gold stripes that go halfway around the sleeve. For every 3 years of service, you would have a stripe. So I had, because my arms are short, I had to move my rank up because I had 13 stripes put on each sleeve, and that's a very impressive uniform. It's styled after the cavalry that was out west, with the blue coats and the yellow stripe down the side of the pants, which is currently the dress uniform for the military, Army. Although they don't have the big yellow things, they went with the service stripes and overseas stripes, just like what used to be the Class A green uniform. So they kind of modified that blue uniform as their Class A formal uniform. Now I understand they're changing it again, but I'm not quite sure what they're going to change it to. From what I understand, it's going to look like the Eisenhower jackets from the 50s in the brown. So with my son, we got 6 grand girls from their family, and my daughter has 2 sons and a daughter. So we've got nine grandchildren besides. So I'm waiting for my son. He's probably going to retire in Minnesota. He's a hunter and a fisherman. He's not leaving that state.
When you first got drafted to right now, what's the difference you saw take place in Milwaukee, the culture, everything?
As I said earlier, when I came back from Vietnam and back into civilian life working at Laddish, if somebody knew that you were in Vietnam, they said, "Really? You were in Vietnam?" There was not any, as much patriotism, I think, back then as occurred after Desert Storm in the early 90s. And patriotism and support of the military has dramatically increased since Desert Storm, and particularly after 9/11. There was a lull there in this country, I think, as far as supporting the military.
Where were you during 9/11? What was taking place? How do you remember the people, the atmosphere at the time?
Well, I was working at Laddish at that time, and about 8 o'clock in the morning, I was on the way to a meeting on the other side of the plant with the maintenance department. And we were just getting into the room, and one of the guys came in and said, "We've just been attacked." And we all said, "What do you mean, just been attacked?" He said, "Yeah, it was a plane that hit the World Trade Center." So the meeting was canceled. I went back to the tool room on the other side of the plant, and the guys already had a small TV that we had in the office there. They had that on, so we were watching what was going on 9/11, and basically saw the second aircraft hit the second tower, and we were just all dumbfounded by what was going on right in front of our eyes.
What were other significant moments throughout your life that you remember quite vividly?
One president that I happened to actually see was John F. Kennedy when he came to Milwaukee. He came down Howell Avenue from the airport heading downtown. We were all lined up on Howell Avenue and watched him zoom go by. That was very fast. They didn't slow down or anything or take their time. They move the president from point A to point B as fast as they can. The other thing that struck me was when I was at junior high school. I was in U.S. history class, and that's when, right before Thanksgiving, and that's when JFK was shot in Dallas. And they told us to all go home. And I was by my cousin's house in Cudahy, and we were kind of watching what was going on with Lee Harvey Oswald, and they were bringing him out of the police department down the hallway there, and we watched live television, watched him get shot right in front of everybody, Jack Ruby. So those were pretty significant things that I would remember from my lifetime.
Were you around when Father Groppi was doing the whole civil rights movement in Milwaukee, and how was that like? How did you see Milwaukee change, becoming from segregated city to people fighting to try to unsegregate?
Well, we did see. I lived on Herman Street, which was right behind the Clark station on Clement and Kinnickinnick Avenue, and the duplexes, all duplexes in that area, and it's all 2 stories. But off our back porch, I could see that intersection along with the Clark station at that point. And there were the civil rights marches going on at that time, and so I was standing on the back porch and basically watched Father Groppi and a protest come right down Kinnickinnick Avenue. I don't remember necessarily good or bad about what was going on within the city itself, but I've served with all nationalities of people in the military, good friends that are all different types of ethnic backgrounds. And I think that has come a long way from when that occurred. Some people might not agree with that today for what is going on with currently what seems to be going on, or what, not so much now, but last year and the year before with the police departments and ethnic groups that are within the various cities within this country. You
mentioned growing up Catholic. How are your beliefs like now?
Well, I went to Immaculate Conception grade school, which was right off of KK and Herman. So I was raised Catholic. Met my wife, who was Southern Baptist. We got married in a Southern Baptist church in Lakeview, and we both came back to Milwaukee, and we went to a Baptist church that was here in Milwaukee, and it was not the same as it was in South Carolina. My wife went to the Catholic church at Immaculate Conception, and she was totally lost. So one of our neighbors asked if we would attend church service in Oak Creek, the Grace Lutheran Church. So we went there with her and decided to join that church. The Lutheran religion seems to be the closest to what I was brought up as a Catholic. It does have the sacraments. And wife was open to believing as to what the Lutheran religion was taught, so teachings. So we're still Lutheran.
Okay. Is there anything else that you would like to talk about from your military career, from your life back in Milwaukee? Anything you want to brush back on?
No, not really. I'm drawing a blank.
Thank you so much for taking the time to tell us your life story. We appreciate it.
Quite welcome.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.